Thanks very much for the invitation. Actually, this is the second time in 20 years that I've spoken publicly on political issues in English, the first time being when you invited me about 15 years ago. And I also noticed when I was writing, I started writing the thing in English, each sentence, and I would wind up ending it in Spanish. So let's see how this thing comes out. This is indeed a very interesting and hot topic. And from the beginning, it's a little more difficult, for example, than the discussion on Cuba, because Cuba, for many, was a real reference point. People who knew who Silvio Rodriguez or Pablo Milanés, Che Guevara. In Venezuela, I've been involved several years now. You know, I don't think I could pick a map and identify every state in Venezuela, which I could in the case of Cuba. So it's an issue, it doesn't have the cultural impact that Cuba had in Latin America, etc. So it's a much more difficult issue, since not that, many people are really up on what's the history of Venezuela, etc. But it is certainly a very timely debate. The Bolivarian Revolution is the first social revolution of the 21st century. And unlike the Zapatista revolution, which also had a huge impact, this is a revolution whose main leader, Hugo Chavez, and now Nicolás Maduro, proclaimed from the beginning that their goal was socialism. Socialism of the 21st century, that is, put the question of what type of society, a social society, back on the agenda after so many years of hearing that the socialism is over and done with, the end of history, etc. So for the world left, this was quite a new experience. It certainly has been the most developed experience. It's one thing, I don't want to counterpose different revolutions, it's one thing running a couple of municipal governments in Chiapas. It's another thing having state power in a country like Venezuela, so it had a whole much more developed experience. And for us here in Mexico, the Venezuelan experience, I would say to some extent, is more important than the Cuban experience, because Venezuela is much more similar to Mexico than Cuba. You have a much more powerful bourgeoisie, Venezuelan bourgeoisie, Mexican bourgeoisie, than the case of Cuba. In 1959, the Cuban bourgeoisie left. That was it. You have a majority of the Venezuelan population, like here in Mexico, is urban. Country is semi-developed. It's largely industrialized. That is, Venezuela and Mexico have a lot more in common than Mexico and Cuba. And, of course, the oil industry. So the evolution of what happens in Venezuela will affect Latin America and the Latin American and world left for a long time to come. And this is an open question, and therefore the importance not only of discussing and getting positive and negative lessons from what's going on, but also the importance of solidarity. And of course, the Venezuelan Revolution has occurred, not just how nice it's the 21st century, but in a world that's very different from 1959, in the case of Cuba, or 1945, 49 in the case of China, to say nothing of 1917. There are a lot of debates going on in Venezuela based on what's occurred that have tremendous importance way beyond the borders of Venezuela itself. There is a whole debate in the Latin American left on what's called the social subject. That is, in traditional left-wing thought, the subject of social change was the working class, and particularly the industrial working class. In Venezuela, there's been a lot of changes in Latin America. In Venezuela, this has been largely codified that the concept of working class is much broader, and subject of social change also includes things like the urban popular movement, which is not just a temporary phenomenon in Latin America, but a permanent phenomenon, particularly when you have trade unions that are largely bureaucratized and don't play the role that they played in the 1930s. The role of women, for example, is obviously a permanent feature of social change in Latin America, much more than was the case in the 1930s or even in the case of the Cuban Revolution. There's also the debate on what type of instrument to affect this social change, the question of the party. In Venezuela, concretely with the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. and this is very important for us here in Mexico and for the world, that as opposed to other revolutionary experiences where economic questions and point of production of the working class were central, in Venezuela it's not just working class concerns, but issues of ecology, issues of women, question of the gay community, that is a much broader social agenda that also corresponds to things that are going on in Venezuela, the United States, Europe, etc. And finally, and I think this is the most important aspect of the Venezuelan Revolution, and I'll give some very concrete examples, the question of democracy and grassroots participation. That is the whole concept of Chavez, and not just Chavez, but the whole concept in Venezuela that the revolution, socialist revolution, has to be democratic or it will not be a socialist revolution. The whole question that one of the lessons that we draw from the debacle in the Soviet Union in the experience of Stalinism, that we want a revolution that not just has a really low infant mortality rate, but that is democratic, is more democratic, not less democratic than what we have now. As the American working class song, the Bread and Roses say, we fight for bread, but also for roses. That is that we want a society that in all aspects is more democratic and more liberating, not just in terms of, very important economic conquests. And this has been much more codified in the case of Venezuela than other previous social revolutions of the 20th century. Okay, so what are the concrete achievements of the process? And later I'll get to the current situation, which is extremely difficult and complicated. I would say that the achievements in Venezuela in a very short period of time were much more intense and far-reaching than in the case of Russia or Cuba or China. In part because unlike Cuba, you didn't have in the beginning a blockade, and you had, of course, oil revenue, which for a long time the oil prices were very high, and they're not now, but I'll get to that in a minute. So you had a series of social changes that were much more intense and deep than in any other situation. And these were accompanied by experiences in workers' control, community councils, which are very important, which I'll also explain in a minute. And unlike, I said, these are all sorts of interesting lessons for social change. Unlike in other social revolutions, the role of Christian-based communities for the first time was very central in the case of Venezuela. In the Marxist movement, we very often, when we talk about individuals, we used to say, oh, they're a very good fighter against social injustice despite their being religious. Well, in the case of Venezuela, it wasn't despite their being religious, it was because of their religious faith that people were inspired to play a role in social movements. And this is something very different. I gave a talk, and I went with someone from the Venezuelan embassy, a young diplomat, youngest diplomat in the history of Mexico, to one of the Escuelas Normales, the agricultural teacher colleges, where, for example, Ayotzinapa, one of those very, very, very radical schools. The school bus has the emblem of Lenin on the side. And the first question, he is a Venezuelan revolutionary and very religious. The first question from the students was, how can you explain, why does Maduro believe in God? How is it possible? So my friend goes, why don't you answer that one? But in Venezuela, it's a very different, the Venezuelan embassy has a nativity scene for Christmas and stuff like that, which isn't my cup of tea, but I think it's very important and very good that the struggle for social justice is much broader and encompasses much broader sections of the Venezuelan working class. And you have these types of reflections on the question of democracy and popular participation. We'll explain in a minute. But we're still talking about a process that is still underway, with warts and all, with all the complications. And precisely because it's still underway, it's important to study and learn the good and the bad from that process. Okay, so I would not say I'm very enthused about the Venezuela, but unlike in the past, this is not a model. There are no recipes. There are experiences and positive and negative lessons, but not a recipe book. Okay, Venezuela, despite its oil wealth, has historically been a very poor country. Extreme poverty was at about 46% of the population before Chavez took over. There were massive protests in Venezuela in 1989, violently put down by the government. And in 1992, there was a civic military rebellion with Chavez taking office in 1998. Since then, there have been 23 elections in 20 years of revolution, in which the revolutionary forces won 21 of them, 4 of which were presidential elections. There have been 2 referendums. What are the achievements? Well, first, I would say the development of what is called participatory democracy and, I'll say, protagonist democracy. It does not translate well in English. In fact, it doesn't make any sense in English. The idea basically being that participatory democracy is pretty clear, but the protagonist democracy is that working people on the neighborhood level in the factories not only are participating, playing a role, but playing the dominant and leadership role in the process. And this is something completely new that we've not heard since 1917 for a few months in Russia, and is very important in the case of Venezuela with its ups and downs. And obviously, and I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, obviously when a revolutionary process is under siege, you don't have the maneuvering room that you would normally have to, be experimenting and giving a lot of leeway and stuff like that. Okay, so it is one thing that's very interesting and very important in this, that Venezuela is the first time where these types of experience have been formally codified. There is a ministry of communes in Venezuela. And they've set up around the country these communes, comunas, and they get the budget from the state for the municipality, and the neighborhood decide how to spend the money, their experience in grassroots community organizing. This is also done through a tremendously successful housing program, which results in the neighborhood administering their own affairs. For the elections in the National Constituent Assembly, this type of grassroots democracy was shown in that the different social sectors made their proposals to be incorporated into laws as social sectors. You had proposals from women, from the gay community, from the labor movement, disabled, youth, and this is a very interesting and very rich experience, again, with its ups and downs. Okay. Part of the achievements, which I'll explain, of course, in large part, were based on oil revenue. 95% of Venezuela's export income comes from oil. And under Chavez, that was used for a whole series of social programs. The Western press would always say, it's populism. Well, okay, and previously, that money went into the pockets of the rich. Now it went into social programs that advanced the well-being of the Venezuelan people. And the Western press was howling that this is populism. Venezuela, still today, despite the drastic drop in oil production and oil prices, which I'll mention, since 1999 has spent more than $400 billion in social programs, and 64% of the gross domestic product of Venezuela goes to social programs. It is unprecedented in the world. At the start of the Bolivarian Revolution, extreme poverty went from 42% in 12 years down to 6.9%. It's a tremendous drop in a relatively short period of time. It took place well before the scheduled date. There was also a significant drop in overall poverty from 49% in 1998 to 27% in 2011. The malnutrition rate fell from 21% to 3%. Unemployment from 15.2% to 5.6%. Infant mortality, which is largely used as an indicator of social development, in this period, we're talking about a relatively short period of years, went from, dropped 50% from 25.6 to 13 per 1,000 live births. Okay, so the revolution, as a result of the Venezuelan Revolution, the country is one of the first places in the world in terms of access to education. In 2005, through what's called the Robinson Mission, there are social missions, I'll explain in a minute, the goal was established of eliminating illiteracy from the country, which involved teaching more than 2 million people to read and write. That has been achieved well ahead of schedule, and today 95 of 100 school-aged children are studying primary school. After Cuba, Venezuela is #1 in Latin America and 5th in the world in terms of the highest gross school enrollment rate. Education receives 7% of the GDP. Before the revolution, it was 3.9%. That is almost double. The Venezuelan Revolution also achieved universal access to health, with 7.8% of GDP being earmarked for health care. There's a series in Venezuela, which I'll mention again, they called Misiones Sociales. They're very concrete programs that address different aspects of inequality that are the product of the capitalist past. One of them is called Barrio Adentro, which is to guarantee free health care for Venezuela. In the first 13 years of the revolution, 13,721 healthcare clinics were built. That is 13 years, 13,721. In the previous 4 decades, 40 years, 5,081 had been built. These were tremendous achievements, well welcomed by the population. There were other missions, for example, the food mission of guaranteeing adequate nutrition to the population. There were tremendous advances in terms of technology and internet, etc. Another very important aspect of the Venezuelan Revolution, very important for the left around the world, was its commitment to internationalism. The formation of the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our Americas, which is an alliance between Cuba, Venezuela, Honduras had been in it until the coup, and several Caribbean countries, Bolivia, which basically using oil income to all sorts of educational programs, medical education for doctors, a whole series of things on that level. It's called ALBA. There is the Union of South American Nations, the Bank of the South, Petro Gellert, to provide oil countries in the Caribbean that don't produce oil with oil at subsidized rates. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, seen as a replacement for the US-dominated OAS. And what is very important in the case of Venezuela is a commitment to ongoing struggles in other countries. That is, Venezuela has very publicly come out in favor of the struggle of the Palestinian people, in favor of independence of Puerto Rico, even on the issue of Catalonia in Spain. The Venezuelan government, I think, was the only one in the world that came out very openly for the right of the people of Catalonia to self-determination. Okay, the social missions, a lot of these achievements were done through a series of about 24 social programs. The missions are divided into 3 main categories. First, education. Illiteracy, basic education, and university studies, all of which are now completely free in Venezuela. Secondly, on the level of food and basic services, including healthcare, which involves ambulatory services in poverty-stricken areas, tending to public spaces, construction of housing. This is very important in Venezuela. Had a big housing deficit. In the last, since the beginning of the century, as of Tuesday, this is Thursday, 1.9 million homes had been built in Venezuela. They are provided, in the case of people who are on the minimum wage, they are free. For other people, they're very subsidized prices. And many of these housing projects, the community itself administers the social services and the running of the areas. There are also programs that attend to the food situation. 5 million Venezuelan families receive subsidized food packages. This has to do with one of the problems of smuggling, which I'll explain in a minute. And there are a whole series of miscellaneous social missions that include for minority and marginalized indigenous communities, attention to the elderly, promotion of agricultural activities to reduce excessive urbanization. They were all aimed at dismantling the vestiges of the social exclusion that existed before the Bolivarian Revolution in Chavez, and to counteract sabotage and the effects of the US and Western sanctions. Okay, the housing mission I already mentioned. As of Tuesday, the 1,932,000 homes had been established of a mission of the goal of having 3 million new homes in Venezuela and addressing the historic housing deficit. 62% of homes, I think it's called in English, the social interest is it called? Entry-level housing, I think is the word in English. I don't want to use the term housing project, it has a very bad negative connotation. I don't know what the best word of describing it. It's low-income housing. 62% is built by social and communal organizations with all sorts of interesting experiences on neighborhood organizations. There are missions on senior citizens that attend to those who, for whatever reason, are not receiving pension. The Children of Venezuela mission, which provides financial aid for teenage mothers and pregnant women, as for families with children under 17, and special subsidies for families that have members who are disabled, regardless of how old a disabled person is. There are all sorts of laws, all sorts of initiatives on price control and everything. Okay. So I said part of the argument, I already responded to, that this is populism, as opposed to the previous situation where it's the rich who benefit from a country's wealth. Now the idea is that the population benefits from that. And the other argument is, I remember there was an article many years ago in Newsweek. It was about the question of Cuba, and they made the point, they go, yes, Cuba has eliminated poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, blah, blah, blah. They call them modest goals. Okay, if they're so modest, why has only Cuba and Venezuela, and now Bolivia, been the only countries in the Western Hemisphere that have been able to achieve this? The other argument, which I think is very funny, is the argument that it's a dictator. The Miami press, I was in Miami for a few hours a few months ago, and they never say Nicolas Maduro without putting the word dictator in front of it. The thing is that the opposition in Venezuela has only recognized elections that they win. And it's very humorous. It's actually, Mexico could learn a lot from the Venezuelan elections. In Venezuela, you vote twice. First, you everything's computerized. So you put your fingerprints in the system, you put it on the screen, and you vote on the screen. Then they give you a paper ballot, and you vote on the paper ballot, and you put that in a box. Then at the end of the day, you have the screen result, and then they count the paper ballots to make sure that they coincide. Jimmy Carter, who is not a flaming leftist, said that the Venezuelan elections are the most democratic in the world. And even in the recent elections that the opposition was screaming fraud, the Latin American Institute of Electoral Observers said, they unanimously said that they were fair and free. So there have been 23 elections in 20 years. This thing of being a dictator, virtually the entire media in Venezuela is in the hands of the opposition. What they basically say, they have attempted the violent overthrow of the government in 2002, and briefly did for a few days until the masses reinstated Chavez. They have engaged in a series of massive violent street protests involving hundreds of deaths. No country in the world would allow this sort of stuff to go on. In Venezuela, I said it is, not only is it not a dictator, it is quite free. You have a deeply anti-democratic, violent, and even terrorist opposition. The coup, the oil industry lockout, and terrorist acts, and violent confrontations in May 2003, from February to May 2014, and from April to May of 2017. And let's see what happens in the next few months with the presidential elections, which the opposition is already threatening to boycott. Okay, today in Venezuela, the situation is very, very difficult. A brutal economic crisis exists in Venezuela as a result of several factors. The most immediate factor is the drastic fall in oil prices. From 2012 to 2016, international oil prices fell 66%, 2/3. So you have a country that has 95% of its foreign income derived from oil sales. You have a 2/3 slash in that amount of income, which any government, any country in the world, that would produce a tremendous economic shock. It's the first time in the history of the world that there were a decline in oil prices for 4 consecutive years. This was combined with a very clear and obvious sabotage campaign on the part of the opposition. In Venezuela, as I said, food was heavily subsidized for the population. Historically in Venezuela, as in many other Caribbean countries, most food is imported. 65 to 70% of Venezuela's food intake was from imported food. And it was very heavily subsidized. So in fuel as well, for a few pennies you could fill your car, your tank. 40% of the subsidized food and fuel was being smuggled to Colombia. Obviously, this type of situation didn't exist in Cuba, which is an island, but in the case of Venezuela, it was there, which has a common, very large border with Colombia. It was a very conscious policy. These products could get market prices in Colombia, and they were subsidized in Venezuela. Secondly, we had the problem of hoarding. And I'm not talking about hoarding on an individual level, which also occurs, but that's not a big problem. That is, if you don't know if there's going to be cooking oil next week, you buy 2 or 3 or 4 liters. That is not an economic and social problem. What you had was, you had 2 capitalist companies which controlled the food market in Venezuela, and they would massively withdraw and hoard products. For example, you could get Mexican products, corn flour, which is used for arepas. It's like a gordita, which is a basic element in the Mexican Venezuelan diet. You could get the Venezuelan corn flour in Superama, here in Mexico, or in Comercial Mexicana, but not in Venezuela. And the question of the black market, which was a massive, please finish and we'll get to that, to questions. Okay, so you have the economic sabotage, the political destabilization, and in the last year or two, and this has become very intensified in the last few months, economic sanctions by Washington and European countries and regional allies, such as Colombia. You had Obama's executive order declaring Venezuela a threat to U.S. security, policies which prevent Citgo in the United States from repatriating dividends, blocking the Venezuela bonds. And some of this is written down in writing. There's the Venezuela Freedom 2 document of the Southern Command. So you have, I don't like to use the term conspiracy, but you have a convergence, let's say, between Washington, U.S. politicians like Marco Rubio and the Republican majority in Congress, ExxonMobil, the local bourgeoisie, the regional bourgeoisie, and local governments. This largely artificial humanitarian crisis was also fueled by a lot of local government, Maduro's errors, which I'll get to in a minute. But you had basically a situation in In Venezuela, to assist with local consumption, companies received subsidized dollars at a subsidized exchange rate for imports. And what they were doing was they were using it for other things and not for imports. So you had giant pharmaceutical companies with subsidized dollars to import products which didn't do so. You had other companies such as Euroclear that governments just refused to sell in Colombia to Venezuela. And I mentioned the case of the food companies. Okay, so while Chavez declared that he was talking about 21st century socialism, unfortunately, the imperialism seemed a lot more like 20th and 19th century imperialism than anything for the 21st century. Venezuela says the crisis is not due to lack of funds, but to the distorted supply mechanisms. There's hoarding with withholding products, the economic war, smuggling, sanctions, the manipulation of the black market exchange rate by companies, and, no question, errors of the Venezuelan government. I would say the main error was on the level of this exchange rate, of trusting that you would have patriotic sectors of the bourgeoisie, that since it was in their short-term economic interest to import, that they would loyally apply the law and apply the policies, which did not happen. Now, I know this is all easier said than done. There have been two types, I think, of criticism of the Venezuelan policies. One from neoliberal journalists and spokesmen and specialists who just say Venezuela should have the same type of policies that Mexico and a whole bunch of other capitalist countries have. Then you have a whole bunch of left-wing sectarian advice. I don't know if people here read the Jornada. A good friend of mine, Guillermo Almeida. Basically, it's a recipe. And it's a recipe that's applied in all times, in all places. It's a recipe that you can apply to Russia in 1917, to Cuba, to Venezuela, to Bolivia. It doesn't vary. Soviets nationalize everything. And actually, the historical experience has been that in all cases where this had to be done, it was done under pressure. In the case of Russia, they didn't want to do it. They had no choice. And in Venezuela, for good or for bad, I said these are very complicated tactical questions. The decision was made not to proceed, to try to go do about it slowly to prevent an economic clash. Perhaps this was wrong. Perhaps I have not seen any good advice on what Venezuela could have done in the context of a revolution that was based on the idea of solidarity and social justice. A lot of things it could have done, in case of, like for example, in Brazil or Honduras and other countries that have as its policy that the poor bear the brunt of the economic crisis. In the case of Mexico, when Mexico had the economic crisis in the 1990s with FOBA, PROA and everything, the first response of the Mexican government was how to safeguard the interests of the banks and the ruling rich. In the case of Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and other countries, the first order of business is how to protect the social conquests of the population and the working class and peasantry. I mean, a very different perspective. And obviously from this flow different projections and proposals and things like that. I said from the point of view of maintaining the social conquests and the project of solidarity and social justice, I've not seen any really concrete proposals for Venezuela. I do not in any, I said the basic strategy was to try to have some breathing room, to reach an agreement with the, what they call the patriotic bourgeoisie, and the result with a preferential exchange rate was a massive robbery of tens of billions of dollars. I do not want to minimize the extent of the crisis that Venezuela is going through today. From 2013 to 2017, the gross domestic product fell 32.5%. It is a mammoth drop. Inflation in 2017 was 1,200%, the highest in the world. Venezuela has the highest country risk perception in the world also. And the devaluation of the bolivar against the dollar was 2,500%. A friend of mine came over a year or so, my nephew of a friend, and he brought me, he left a stack of bolívares, the Venezuelan currency, but I'd like it because they have the Bolivar's image and it's a revolutionary country. He left me 350 bolívares, which at the time was worth $50. Today it is worth less than 1/3 of a cent. And this affects everything in Venezuela, and then, frankly, their mechanisms have been very slow to counteract that. In Venezuela, for example, the ATM machines only give, I think they've just changed it now, to a limit of, there had been 10,000 bolívares, they only give, the maximum you can get out of an exchange, out of the ATM is 25 cents. So today you have a situation, even street vendors accept credit card and debit cards. But it's a terrible situation for people who are experiencing this in Venezuela. And friends of mine who are very loyal to the revolution and consider themselves very strong Chavistas say that they are hurting and people are hurting from the question of the economic crisis. At the same time, free healthcare has been maintained with shortages of medicine, free education, highly subsidized electricity, transportation, and pensions, with minimum wage and pensions being raised constantly. It is one of the, despite everything, it is one of the countries with the lowest external debt in the world at 38% of GDP. There are European countries that have well over 1,000% GDP. Luxembourg, which is hardly a poverty-stricken country. Okay, so the question is, how, in the face of this crisis, do the revolutionary forces win the last few elections? The natural thing would be people, and there are people who say, I am really fed up with this, anything would be better than what we have now, and there of course are people who say that. In the elections for the July 3rd National Constituent Assembly, the opposition boycotted it, but they held their own makeshift referendum a few weeks previously. The Constituent Assembly elections had much more voter participation than the opposition elections. On October 15th, there were elections for state governorships, 23, 18 of which were won by the Chavista forces. 70% of the vote went for the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. According to opinion polls, 37% of the population supports the Great Patriotic Poll, which are the Chavista parties, and 22% support the opposition. And of course, there's a big group of people in the middle there. Why, in the face of this type of situation, do people, particularly poor people, continue to vote for the Chavista parties? I would say there are 5 or 6 reasons. First, the fear, very correctly based fear, that the opposition, if it wins, will take away social gains and the social missions. The opposition was so aware of this that they said that they wouldn't touch the social missions, which no one believes, since they've done it every place else when they come to power. Chavez still remains the most popular figure in Venezuelan history, and there still is millions of people that consider themselves Chavistas, people who think the problem of corruption in the government can't be supported any much longer, it's too much. People who have a lot of correct criticisms of the government still consider themselves Chavistas. In the 2015 elections, which was one of the few the opposition won, this base of support largely did not go to the polls. They didn't vote for the right-wing opposition, they just stayed home. In the last 2 elections, that situation has changed. Why? I said, 1, the fear that if the opposition wins, they will revert to Venezuela to what it was before. Secondly, the rejection of opposition violence. So not only the more than 150 deaths last year, there were 20 cases of Chavista supporters being burned alive. All this had a very deep effect in Venezuela, and people who would normally be for the opposition said they didn't want these type of violent street protests. Third, you now have a divided, as a result, you now have a divided and demoralized opposition. They were not united in the last two elections. Some of them very openly call for a US invasion, which is another factor. People, obviously, any Venezuelan patriot, even if they disagree with the government, doesn't want to see their country invaded by the likes of Donald Trump. So you have a divided and demoralized opposition, and when it won the elections in 2015, was utterly incapable of proposing any alternative economic proposal. So people who normally might be inclined to vote for an opposition just because they're up to here with the economic crisis saw that in 2 years in office, they were not able to make any sort of proposal to move the country forward. And finally, there is no question that the different structures that the revolution has implemented, the communes, the community councils, and it's called CLAP. It's this massive program with 5 million Venezuelan families to provide subsidized food as a countermeasure to the hoarding and shortages. That all of these things did have an effect of mobilizing the Chavista base. I would say the government has basically an intelligent strategy, but that it's very soon, it's going to have a short window of opportunity to start providing some solutions, because people are not going to be able to put up with the situation forever. In the Constituent Assembly basically had 7 objectives, which I think is the main government strategy. First of all, to largely, and this has happened in all revolutionary processes, to bypass the bourgeois National Assembly, the parliament, with a view toward another type of mass, working class, popular and people's power. But basically, I would say 7 objectives. First, to achieve peace and affirm the values of social justice through dialogue. It's a permanent offer of the government. Secondly, to broaden and improve the economy and system based on productivity, and this is very important, diversification. Because I think one of the things you can criticize correctly the Chavez government was that it thought that the oil boom would continue. You know, lots of people do. Very few people really have a long-term vision, and if you can, you know, get by with what's happening right now and everything looks good, it's, you know, difficult to sacrifice that to diversify the economy, although it definitely should have been done. Thirdly, to codify the social missions in the Constitution, to prevent them being taken away by a change in government. Fourthly, to codify new elements in the justice system against terrorism and against drug trafficking. 5, to codify, to enshrine the communes and communal systems as a form of government. You can even say it's dual power, that is, that of not just administering local communities, but of taking decisions that affect people's lives on a local level, to enshrine that and codify that in the Constitution, and to provide space for new forms of democracy, the protagonist democracy, participatory democracy, and direct democracy, and to defend national sovereignty against foreign intervention, which to a large extent is the Achilles heel of the opposition. The opposition will not condemn the US sanctions, and sectors of them very openly call for a military invasion of the country. Okay, will it be possible for the Bolivarian Revolution to obtain the breathing space it needs to move forward? We're not talking about 10 years or even 5 years, maybe even not 1 year. It better do this pretty quickly. This is an open question. How long will a population be willing to put up with economic deprivation before its will and its political consciousness become undermined? I said, you know, I have tons of Venezuelan friends who say they're never going to vote for the opposition, but really reaching the end of their limits. How many of us would be willing to put up with this? So these are, you know, open questions. It makes the question of international solidarity, particularly against the sanctions, particularly more important. I would say it's a very complicated situation. I don't think there are any easy answers. There never are. I don't think there are any easy answers. People who have recipe books, they're nice recipe books, but they usually cannot be implemented. I think like all processes, it has its errors, it has its warts and all, it has its ups and downs. It's a complicated situation. What is not complicated, however, is taking sides. On the one side, you have the vast majority of the working people of Venezuela and their government attempting, warts and all, to build a new democratic society based on social justice and human solidarity. On the other side, you have the upper class and the elites, the right-wing and neoliberal opposition, US imperialism and its allies, including the Mexican government. So independently of a very necessary critical assessment of what's going on in Venezuela, I think it's clear what side those of us who are concerned about human emancipation, social justice, and building a better world, I think it's very clear what side we have to take on all this.
Well, a lot has been put out for you to mull over, and now we have opportunity for you to ask questions and to deepen the understanding of any points that you're curious about. We have several hands here. We'll start there and then go to the back and there. Fran?
Yes. I like to put things in a little more of a quantify things, if you don't mind. So the two parts to my question. Number one, could you define when the revolution, as you define it, took place, who the leaders are, and could you follow the sequence of your presidents through to present day for those of us that are not that familiar, all right? And because, and with that, I'd like to have you define what you refer to as the opposition. You've used that time and time again.
Yeah.
Number two, could you please, in your words, explain what the reason is for the U.S. embargo, possibly from a Venezuelan standpoint or from a U.S. standpoint?
Yeah, okay. The Chavez movement did not begin with any sort of socialist objectives. It was basically a democratic movement in military ranks. It had an uprising which was not successful. Chavez won in 1998-99, the elections. And when Chavez had cancer and died, Maduro was the next candidate. Now, the process has been built in the first decade of the century. It was clear, as it should have been, that a political instrument was necessary. So the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, was formed. Unlike in the case of Cuba, there was no requirement for the revolutionary forces to be involved in this project. So, for example, the Communist Party of Venezuela, which actually was not at all revolutionary in the 1960s, did not support guerrilla warfare, was a very, what we would call a reformist organization, did not participate. Today, the Venezuelan Communist Party is very critical of the Maduro government. So, in addition to the PSUV, you have it's the Great Patriotic Pole, which unites all of the different currents, but that still considers those Chavistas and more or less support the government. The PSUV completely, others with a more critical approach. In addition, well, you have a whole bunch of grassroots organizations. I have been trying to find out to what degree the PSUV really exists as a grassroots party, because there are a lot of complaints that it's basically an electoral instrument, like we've seen in Mexico with a lot of opposition parties, and to what degree is it bureaucratized? It does not have, in the case of traditional left-wing parties, for example, really a press of its own. To what degree, I've seen that they have some, study sessions and things like that. To what degree there's a debate also that the party needs to be independent of the government and be able to criticize the government and not be just a mechanism, I forget the term in English too, transmission belt for government decisions. I said the good thing in Venezuela has been, despite the pressure, there has not been, a suppression of left-wing criticism of the government and everything like that. There have been defections, as in all social processes. People who were initially on board, as the process moved to the left, jump ship. That has absolutely happened in the case of Venezuela, but the core nucleus, and it was very important in the case of Venezuela, the armed forces have remained united, with very few exceptions, behind the, but still as you basically have the nucleus of your Chavista leadership. Maduro does not have the charisma that Chavez had. He actually was a bus driver, which is an interesting experience. But basically, you have a line of continuity with Chavez before he died saying that his confidence was in Maduro. The opposition, the majority of the opposition, it's a right-wing opposition. There are some left-wing sectors, I'll get to in a second, that are openly against the government, do not support, do not vote in favor of Maduro, do not in any way call for the overthrow of the government. These left-wing groups are generally very, very small. You have a couple Bandera Roja of Maoist origin. You have a couple of Trotskyist groups that call for the overthrow of the government. There are other groups, of course, on the far left that give critical support to the government. Unfortunately, I wish they had more power, because a lot of their criticisms I find very interesting. But when they have competed in the elections, they've gotten very few votes. Most people in Venezuela see the elections as being polarized. And in a polarization, people polarize their vote, or they vote for the lesser evil, or they vote, to whoever they think is going to be able to beat their enemy. The opposition is split. Well, it's now dissolved as such. It's called the MUD, the Democratic Unity Roundtable, that united the entire right-wing opposition. The head of it was this guy Capriles, Enrique Capriles, who ran against Chavez in several elections. He had been the governor in the state of Miranda. Today he is one of the somewhat more moderate voices in this opposition. Some of them are the people in the opposition are openly in favor of a military coup and a right-wing dictatorship. There are others, that's why they split. It no longer exists as such. You have different, I would say like a half a dozen different right-wing groups with different degrees of being right-wing. And that's one of the reasons that the government and the PSUV feel they have more maneuvering room, precisely because the opposition is now split over whether it should participate in elections. The Venezuelan people overwhelmingly, 89% in opinion polls said they want a peaceful solution, which is normal. I mean, who would say, no, I prefer violence? But there are sectors. And the violence in the street had a very big impact. So it split the opposition. And then, for example, when you have the Pope calling for a dialogue, and the Maduro government says, let's have a dialogue, so the opposition split between those who were willing to have a dialogue with the government and those who weren't. In the last gubernatorial elections, the opposition won 4 states. But even in the states where it didn't win, some of their gubernatorial candidates said, against the move, no, the opposition, we lost. It was fair elections, but we lost. So this type of thing plays out very badly among the population that just views the opposition of being an opposition for the sake of opposition and not with it being concerned with the real interests of the Venezuelan people. Okay, the question of the embargo, it's getting worse. It's not on the level of Cuba yet, because, for example, the U.S. depends on Venezuelan oil. So they're trying to restrict repatriation of dividends and profits and everything like that. But it's a thing that's constant in Venezuela. It's Monday this week, 4 days ago, HSCB, the HCBS, what is it?
HSBC.
Froze the bank accounts of all Venezuelan diplomats in Mexico. They can't get their salaries or to withdraw their money from their bank accounts. So you have constant things like that against selling products to Venezuela, against moving money around, which is creating a huge amount of problems in Venezuela. So it makes it more difficult, obviously, for a democratic discussion and a consideration of alternatives when you have the most powerful country in the world having their foot on your neck. And not only is it the most powerful country in the world, Venezuelans, along with people from every other country in the world, including the United States, very, very frightened of what Donald Trump might do next. So it's a very complicated situation. Behind the boycott is in Colombia, the United States, the right-wing government in Spain, and a good part of foreign companies as well. Most companies, airlines have canceled flights to Venezuela. It just makes daily life a lot more complicated in Venezuela. And I said I don't in any way, either want to say that the situation is positive, and of course I don't want to say either that these are just petty bourgeois types that want their to be able to go out and eat in restaurants. It's a crisis that's affecting daily life in Venezuela, and it's very difficult getting people to be involved in these day-to-day communal experiments when you have to spend time on food lines and you have to try to find out where they're selling chicken, and it's a daily battle, particularly on the question of food and medicines. So it leaves people tired and not willing to do the type of things that a project based on mass participation requires. It's a very difficult situation that is, there's no historical experiences on this type of situation. And no one, this is important, no one in Venezuela is proposing outlawing the opposition or creating a single-party state or nationalizing corner food stands and stuff like that. So it's, people are very conscious in Venezuela, including in the governing United Socialist Party, that, the answer is not a repeat of the Soviet experience in Venezuela. No one in Venezuela is proposing anything like that.
Why?
That was a very thorough response. We have a number of other hands. In the back, Jeff?
Barack Obama's statement in Venezuela.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I said Barack Obama's statement that Venezuela is a threat is obviously absurd. But first question is, what can you tell us about how the Colombians, the Europeans, and the other parts of that international boycott, how they rationalize what they're doing in Venezuela? The second part of the question, the second question is, in addition to the boycott, which is a publicly acknowledged effort, what can you tell us about the U.S. intervention on the level of undermining politics and on the level of clandestine operations?
Great, yes. Perfect. Yeah, I'm sorry I left that out as important. I understand your question. I left it out. I think the U.S. I don't think it's of course oil. If what was the old saying that if Kuwait produced broccoli instead of oil, there would never have been an invasion of Kuwait. And there's no question that oil wealth is an important factor. But I think beyond that, I think the U.S. fears any sort of political expression outside of their control. Honduras, the OAS said the elections were fraudulent, and the U.S. government, along with the local powers that be, say that the elections were fair. So I think in general, the U.S., even experiences that did not directly threaten U.S. interests, like Lula in Brazil, the U.S. is hostile to Evo in Bolivia, to any experience that it is not in direct control over. It fears anything, any form of protest that will go beyond limits. I don't want to get involved. It's a Mexican citizen. Clearly, I realize this is not the place to talk about Mexican politics. I think the same fear of López Obrador. It's not his program as such, which doesn't challenge the capitalist system. I think the fear of López Obrador in this huge campaign we're going to be seeing, we are seeing and are going to be seeing about him being another Chavez, Russian interference in Mexico. It's also the thing, not so much the fear of López Obrador, it's the fear of the social forces that can be unleashed in any sort of process with that. The U.S. government, a lot of the stuff on this U.S. intervention, it's in writing. The massive amounts of U.S. funding through the U.S. Embassy and programs like the USAID to the Venezuelan opposition. They don't deny it. It's in writing. It's public. The U.S. Embassy in Venezuela and Washington have a continual and public program, they call it Promoting Democracy, that involves financially subsidizing the Venezuelan opposition. And the, what's his name in Colombia, Uribe in Colombia, you had paramilitary gangs controlled by the right-wing Colombian movements on the border, creating trouble, assisting with the smuggling, attacking Venezuela. It's a, they view the Venezuelan experience as quite threatening there. So I said it's a very public thing. Obama didn't even believe that Venezuela represents a threat to U.S. security. But these types of things, you know, they make investors very nervous. They undermine the possibility of Venezuela trying to overcome its crisis. And there's a real problem with that today in terms of investment, in terms of companies willing to sell. It's the same situation with Cuba, where even when companies were given payment in advance, companies did not want to sell to Cuba because they didn't want to incur the wrath of the U.S. government. That happened a lot here in Mexico, where I had personal contact with companies that would not, drug companies and pharmaceutical chains, that they were excellent Cuban medications. They would not handle them because they did not want to incur the wrath of the U.S. government. And it's the same, you know, Venezuela does not have the medical industry that Cuba has, although it's had a tremendous amount of joint programs with Cuba to train doctors for emerging market countries and stuff like that. But the sanctions are a real factor today in Venezuela in terms of frightening off investors, in terms of the Venezuelan oil industry and bonds and Venezuelan paper and everything like that. Because the country has to exist in a capitalist world and in world financial markets. So you have the leading countries in world financial markets saying don't have anything to do with Venezuela. It obviously has an effect. But I do want to be very clear that the political issues, the financing for the opposition, the fact that the U.S. Embassy, as in many other countries, directly has intervened in Venezuelan life. The 2000 coup, there's no question that the U.S. Embassy was involved in the preparations and the outcome of the coup to overthrow the Chavez government. At the time, there was no one in the world that thought that that government did not have mass support in Venezuela. And in fact, the masses came in the street and defeated the coup. When the coup took power, the first thing it did was abolish the judicial system, parliament, everything that supposedly the democratic axis would be opposed to. The U.S. government supported that. The U.S. government did the same in Honduras with the coup against the democratically elected government of Zelaya. It's a continued U.S. policy. I said, we might be talking about 20th century socialism. Unfortunately, we're talking about 20th century imperialism.
Okay, this is next, and after that, there was a hand over here. Yeah, right, okay.
Here.
Yeah, just a comment on undermining investor faith in Venezuela. We just watched a movie called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, and the Koch brothers have this kind of dirty oil
I haven't seen
refinery in Corpus Christi, so they're trying to bring back the Keystone Pipeline and take the dirty oil from Canada, so they can just cut it off from Venezuela and undermine investor base, and also to crush Cuba further because Cuba gets subsidized. But I just wanted to comment, or ask you to comment, if you will. I discern some similarities between the hoarding that you mentioned by the large food importers and the situation with the socialist democratically elected government of Allende in Chile.
Yes. Oh, absolutely, yes.
And along with Americans strategizing with the military and then installed a dictatorship. So just, would you please comment on that? And also, there was recently a kind of a rogue military operation in Venezuela. So I'm wondering if you think that the threat might more be from a military coup than from an overt invasion by the Americans.
Okay, I think one of was one of the cards the U.S. was playing. They thought that the military would collapse. Not collapse, but the military would be divided. So far that hasn't happened. There was the attempt. The guy took helicopters. There were some minor elements, but thus far, apparently the military has remained very solid on that. So there's no question on that. But the Chile thing, you're absolutely right. And in Mexico City, which has a big Chilean refugee population from the 1971 coup, people were saying this is an exact replica of what happened in Chile, of trying to create the economic conditions and hoarding and destabilizing the market, which first would get the middle class up in arms and then would just wear down popular. It was just a classic textbook case from Chile of what had happened. Exactly. The Chileans in Mexico City were saying that is exactly what happened in Chile against the democratically elected government of Allende.
Okay, a woman here, and then back there, and here. Yes.
This morning I was watching the news in Spanish, but trying to improve my Spanish, but I certainly don't understand everything. And it really piqued my interest, because I knew I was coming to this today. And it was about Oscar Perez. And I'm assuming he was a member of the opposition that was killed by government forces a couple of days ago. Was he?
He was no, in the armed forces.
The armed
forces. Launched a armed attack on the Justice Ministry, Parliament, and recently they had it was a military confrontation. He was killed in a military confrontation. When he launched the attack, he called on the armed forces to join in to overthrow the government. He was isolated. No one responded to him. He was killed in the military. Terrorist. Any other country would be considered terrorist.
Yes, Ed?
The State Department has shown, the State has indicated that because of the unrest or instability of Venezuela, that global terrorism is setting up bases within Venezuela. I don't know if it's from the right or if it's from the existing government, but can you comment on the possibility of states like groups like ISIS forming within Venezuela, and is it a threat at all to any of the Western countries?
Yeah, actually, the press of the establishment, for example, here in Mexico, it's called the Diario Judío, a Jewish digital newspaper, Zionist. Also has that about Hezbollah training in Venezuela and ISIS training. It really is just absolute ridiculous. If that were to occur, which is zero possibility, it would be in Mexico, not in Venezuela. I mean, you still have to get from Venezuela to the U.S. But this is part of a propaganda campaign. I was mentioning yesterday there was a movie, I don't know if anyone here saw it, it's an idiotic movie a number of years ago called Red Dawn, about a successful Sandinista invasion of the United States. You know, this is just propaganda designed to undermine the Venezuelan government. It would be ridiculous. I mean, the thing about this, you know, the thing with ISIS and stuff, or Al-Qaeda and stuff, just absolute garbage, the idea that they are training in Venezuela. There's been absolutely no evidence whatsoever, or even the people, you know, when terrorist attacks have occurred in the United States, there's been no evidence that any of them came from Latin America.
Yes, here.
First of all, you sound like you have a New York accent.
Yep.
Yeah?
You should have seen it 20 years ago.
Secondly, I'm not clear what the government is doing to try and restructure the financial situation. Have they cut back on giving all this money to people, these subsidies? I mean, when the situation changes, you know, you have to deal with it. The second question is, what does a family do? They have 2 high school kids. What do they say about their future?
Yeah, okay, the second one, I said they had the CLAP program, which has about 5 million families, and you get a subsidized, a fairly decent amount, not sufficient, but a fairly decent amount of subsidized products. But I said it's tough. And friends of mine, none of friends of mine are going hungry, but they're saying that, you know, to get a chicken is not easy, and toilet paper has been running out, and you know, things happen in Chile, happen in Cuba, and stuff like that. It is not, it's a good question. How, I've said the government is trying to take control of the situation, and it's difficult without a program of massively nationalizing companies. They have tried at different points to jail executives of companies that were hoarding and stuff. They say they're taking the measures, not only in terms of distribution, but having greater control over production and the distribution channels. They have to be, you know, I said I'm not privy to their internal discussions in Venezuela, but, you know, friends of mine who in the embassy, that is diplomats, people who are in the government, you know, everyone is hurting from the situation.
But are they cutting back these subsidies that they're giving on everything?
No, they're not cutting back the subsidies for the population. In fact, they're increasing the subsidies for the population. They're trying to cut down on what had been subsidies for the companies, for the bourgeoisie. That they're trying. They're saying that the problem is not so much the lack of financial resources. It's been the manipulation of the exchange rate and other market distortions. Venezuela actually was making payments on its external debt. A lot of people were saying, put a moratorium on external debt payments. Venezuela, up until the last couple of months, was making regular payments on its external debt. But I said it's not, I'm not privy to the internal discussions going on, but it seems to me they've got very, very little time to rapidly turn the situation around.
I don't know how they make those payments with the decline in value of their currency.
They're having a new currency linked to oil reserves. That is exactly for that question, there is a solution, and that is, I think it's Petro, to have a concrete response on that level, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
John.
I wonder why Venezuela can't become more self-sufficient in food. Following maybe Cuba's example, it would seem it wouldn't take too long to have more urban agriculture and other things so that they don't have to depend on imports.
There was, yeah, actually they had been making major advances on that. But still, like every Caribbean country, I don't think any of the Caribbean countries are self-sufficient in food. And, you know, it was easier to import from the United States. But gains had been made. They had been moving, that had been one of the goals, and gains had been made on that. But for example, a very basic staple is the corn flour, which is used for arepes. And the problem was its control by the company Polar and another company. That was your major problem, not so much the production. I understand, for example, that fruits and vegetables and stuff are pretty readily available in Venezuela. But yeah, the situation is very, very, very difficult.
Yes, way in the back.
Two questions. Knowing the value of the oil and the volume of the oil decline, I wonder if, the first question, can the 21st century revolution survive without being able to attract 21st century investment in 21st century technology? The second question relates to, has there been a brain drain? Have the brightest young minds been hanging around or trying to get out of it?
Why don't we get all the questions at once?
Okay.
Let me just answer that one. I don't know about the technological updating of the oil industry, which is also a major problem in Mexico. I don't know about that. There has been immigration. I'm not sure the immigration has been on that massive a scale. And you have large Venezuelan populations in the US and Spain, to a much lesser extent here in Mexico. But I'm not sure that it's that massive. And what has been massive is that you have a massive influx of poor students into the universities. I'm not sure whether that process has reached the point where it translates into fully trained and educated professionals. That takes a number of years. But from what I've seen of the figures on immigration from Venezuela, it's high, but not, you know, anything out of the Latin American context. You have throughout Latin America, I think in Uruguay, about a third of the population immigrated in the 1970s. Everyone talks about the Cuban exiles. You had huge immigrations. You have countries in the Caribbean, which is where Venezuela is located, where you have a greater percentage of your population living outside the country than you have living inside the country. From what I can see about Venezuela, it might also be that it's not that easy anymore to be immigrating. The U.S. doesn't have for Venezuela what it had for Cuba, that is an open door policy of stimulating immigration. So you have the Venezuelan population in Mexico has increased somewhat, but not massively.
Okay, we're going to take 2 or 3 questions together. Roberto, and then here. Is there a third? Okay, go ahead.
Sí, bueno, quiero preguntar acerca del rol que ha tenido el ejército en Venezuela. El origen de Chávez fue dentro del ejército y bueno, con ciertas particularidades, cierta formación y demás. Y bueno, ¿qué tan distinto ha sido el comportamiento del ejército en relación a ejércitos de otros países de América Latina, que normalmente se benefician para ellos mismos, ¿no?, de la situación?
Okay, and then there was a question here.
Mine's really just a comment. I just came back from, I was just a month in Colombia, and the kind of the talk is that there are a lot of Venezuelans coming in, but they're,
Colombia, yes, absolutely.
They're actually welcoming them, or at least not opposing them, because Venezuela helped Colombia out in a similar situation in the past, and they were all one state at one time. It was part of the Bolivarian state. So that, but I, when I was there in Colombia, I met a number of Venezuelans doing entry jobs, taxis, barbers, that kind of thing. So but they have family there too, because they were all at one time all connected.
Yeah, it's the other way around. You have a huge number of Colombians living in Venezuela.
Yeah.
So yeah, the army. ¿Te respondo en español o inglés?
Inglés.
The army is everyone. I think on the left also. People were expecting that part of the army, at least part of the army, if not most of the army, would be the first sector that would break from the Chavez's project and go over to imperialism. Why? Because that's always been the way it's happened in Chile with General Pinochet. It's always happened in Latin America. For whatever there have been cases of army generals being arrested on charges of having been involved in coup attempts. You also have in every revolution, you have a certain division in the army where your base, the rank and file soldiers, coming from the population, are obviously more loyal to the revolutionary project. But it was, I think, to everybody's surprise that possibly because Chavez himself came out of the army, as opposed to Allende in Chile or Fidel in Cuba, where he had a counter-army of the rebel army, that since the nucleus of the revolution in Venezuela, Chavez's movement, came out of the army, I assume he had his contacts and had greater knowledge of what was going on. And they're actually on that level, they really knew how to control that. They've not necessarily been very good on a lot of the economic issues. On the question of making sure that their flank was protected on the level of the armed forces, that I think they've done a very good job. And every time that there's been an attempt by minority sectors in the armed forces to move against the government, they have nipped it before it came to anything. The only exception was this Perez guy, which seemed to be, it was in a movement, but a very numerically minor movement that they were immediately able to counteract with the support of the armed forces. It's been different. Traditionally, on the left, we've always said that the army in a revolution gets divided, with the ranks going with the people and the tops going with imperialism and the upper class, and that the police always side with the upper class. And now we've seen in Honduras where the police refuse to open fire on the masses, and in Venezuela where the unity of the armed forces, with some very minor exceptions, has basically, since 1999, there have basically not been any splits in the armed forces.
Okay, Steve, and then I'll have a question too.
Early on in your presentation, I understood you to say that a unique feature of the Chavismo movement was the collaboration of the Christian faiths and so forth. Sounded consistent to me with the liberation theology movement in the Catholic Church. And so my question is, to what extent was that true then? To what extent does it continue to be true now? And what is their role in helping cement this solidarity that's apparently still fairly strong?
Okay, my question, the Bolivarian Revolution gave a lot of impetus to what came to be called the pink tide in Latin America. And now it's being said the pink tide is receding, and I'm just curious what you see the impact of the problems in Venezuela will be elsewhere in Latin America.
No, the Venezuelans are quite concerned about, with now a right-wing government in Brazil. The Honduran situation is still undecided. Let's see what happens in Mexico. There's no question that a regional isolation will hurt Venezuela, and they're quite concerned about that. The re-election of País in Ecuador was obviously a good sign for them. But the situation certainly in Brazil had a very negative impact, and what happens in Mexico will have a very big impact. Regardless of whatever López Obrador's international program is, a victory for López Obrador in Mexico will have a huge impact in Latin America in terms of correlation of forces. But there's no question that the Macri government in Argentina has been on a constant campaign against Venezuela, pushing for sanctions, pushing to have Venezuela expelled from the regional alliances. On the other hand, the Macri government is also under a lot of local pressure and a lot of rejection locally, but there's no question that this pink tide has a big effect. The Christian, the Catholic Church hierarchy is against the revolution. That did absolutely, with a son, local priests obviously supported. What was different in the case of Venezuela, even in the case of Cuba, for example, there was a campaign against religious faith in Cuba. They didn't jail people and stuff, but there was, in the schools, there was a campaign against organized religion and against religious belief in Cuba, to say nothing of Russia. This has not at all happened in Venezuela, and I said friends of mine, diplomats and people in high positions in Venezuela, say that they are inspired. It's not, they're not revolutionaries despite the fact that they believe this. They are revolutionaries precisely because they believe this. This was not present in any of the other social revolutions of the 20th century. All of them were accompanied, for better or for worse, I think very often, probably better, but there's been nothing of that sort in Venezuela. And even in the solidarity movements around Latin America, there's a big Christian component in that. Nobody in Venezuela, I don't think even the right wing, has complained that there's any sort of discrimination against the church in Venezuela or anything like that. It's the church that parts of the church hierarchy are in league with that.
Okay, Ata, and then here.
Con la guerra mediática contra Venezuela, yo siempre me he preguntado como mexicano qué hubiera pasado en Venezuela si hubiera un caso como el de Ayotzinapa, ¿no? O sea, imaginando que en Venezuela sucediera algo como lo de Ayotzinapa. Y me gustaría que se comentara o sea, porque se habla mucho de la violencia, ¿no?, en Venezuela. Me gustaría que se dijera cuántos muertos llevamos en México desde que entró Calderón al poder y cuántos muertos ha habido en Venezuela desde que entró Chávez al poder.
And then over here. And these will be the last two questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So the chances of López Obrador becoming president will not happen until the U.S. becomes a tropical country or a sea or something like that, and it's all related. So.
Well, as I said, I don't want to get involved in the discussion of Mexico. For truth and clarity's sake, I won't mention I'm a member of Morena. But, you know, it's not like 100 years, the United States would, you know, not invade Mexico.
It's already invaded.
Yeah, right. But yeah, there will be a lot of, if López Obrador is elected, and I think it has more to do with electoral fraud in Mexico than anything the United States does, the government will be under very strong pressure. But at the same time, a Morena government in Mexico would be a big relief for Venezuela and for every other political process in Latin America. And it would have more of an effect on Venezuela than, for example, when it was very good, the Sandinista government in Ortega in Nicaragua, but Nicaragua has a limited effect outside of Central America.
Well, that's the perfect reason why there would never be a socialist presidential government in Mexico.
Well, we will see. The question, yeah, it was interesting. After Ayotzinapa, when they were discovering all of these clandestine graves, they didn't find any students, but they found plenty of other clandestine graves in Guerrero, and now I think in Nayarit. They just mammoth amount. Venezuelan friends said, no, that this in the Fifth Republic, that before Chavez, this was very common in Venezuela. The 1989 protests were put down with, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of deaths. There was vicious repression in Venezuela. What there has been in Venezuela, people say about the crime rate, but even apparently that was very exaggerated, that, you know, it was a high crime rate, but not worse than Bogota or even Mexico City or a lot of other. The murder rate in Venezuela was high, but nothing exceptional. And there's been no, with the exception of the guy who did the Lopez who just got killed, there's been no, and it was in a military confrontation, there have been no accusations against the deaths. The majority of the deaths in the protests were inflicted by the right-wing opposition against people they conceived to be Chavistas, not the other way around. And they were very, very violent confrontations.